turn the computer around so you can see us.
Oh.
Yep.
Hello.
Yep.
I was interested in what is this sort of
Camera is on. There we go. Hi.
Can you see me?
Yes. All right. We can see you.
All right. Cool. Cool.
Yeah. So Chris and Todd are here.
Okay.
And we're hoping some more people will drift in. We've had a really good weekend, great crowds, but and we know some people are supposed to be coming back for this, but we'll just have a good time with it. So
I mean, it's all good, man. Don't worry about it. I'm just excited to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you. We're going to kind of let you lead us on the clips since you know what to talk about there. We're going to start just with general things.
Okay, that's fine.
Just hang out and we'll get started in a bit.
All right, I'm going to get the questions pulled up because I know you had some questions here. So
yeah. Be technically fast.
Using an Xbox controller to do it. Yeah. It's working. Oh. Look at my arm. It actually works pretty well too. I'm not blocking you. Yeah. Yeah, I can do it from here.
Yeah.
All right. What clips do you want?
Wait a second here. There was a clip where they were entering the in the New Hope, where they're entering that canteen, and we get a very brief shot of what looks like a werewolf. Hold on, let's see if I can find that because I know I emailed you all the timestamps on that.
Yeah. Yep. This one right here.
Yeah, it should be like 44 minutes, 54 seconds.
Do you know what the name of the file is? ROJ something, I think, right?
No.
Here, let me see it. Open this one.
I mean, if not, I've got it pulled up on my end too, so I can just share my screen, just in case.
Let's do that.
Okay. Yeah, if you could pull it up on your screen share, because I'm having to do all this with a controller right now.
You're good. What I also did was I pulled up some images too. So while we're waiting, I was just pulling up some images just so we could have that on hand as well. I'll probably just show like one or two clips, really, just to keep things moving along.
Okay, I'm going to do some intros and ask a general question, and then we'll get started. Okay, you ready?
Sounds like a plan. Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Claiborne, and I'm the Secretary of Alternative Stage Haunted Camera Code. We've had a wonderful festival so far. We hope you're enjoying it. And this, of course, is our film tent. We're doing something a little bit different this time. We're not just talking to filmmakers, but we're talking to people who love films as much as filmmakers do. And we're going to talk about horror influences on other genres, which is a bit of a twist. And that twist was suggested by our virtual panelists. And aren't we sophisticated today? This is Luka Suon, the movie pope, and he's
Well,
a movie buff.
Well, I'm not a movie pope. I just work with the movie pope. I'm his
Oh,
underling.
okay. So you're the movie lord then.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, you'll accept that. And to my immediate right is Chris Stonnell of the Postmortem Players, who were fabulous on stage last night. And he's also a big movie buff. And to his right is filmmaker, director, actor Todd Bagley, who has worked with us before, and screenwriter as well, who studied in the David Lynch MFA program in screenwriting. So, and actually met Mr. Lynch online. Okay. All right. Well, so we have a distinguished panel today, and Chris is joining us all the way from Charlotte. I think Luka is in the Charlotte area as well. And so let's begin, and we are going to have time for audience questions as well. But let's start with our panel discussion by asking just anyone who wants to jump in. How have works from the horror genre influenced your own work in other genres? Anyone may answer.
I just want to give others the chance to answer. Mine's kind of long-winded.
Go for it, Luka. We're trying to be polite, but you go first, buddy.
Oh, okay. So that question, I had to do a lot of research and writing about this. Actually, it started all the way back in May of this year, and the question that I was asking was, are there? It's not so much horror, but more of a gothic influence in other genres, and the one that came to mind was Star Wars. So the original, the prequel, and the sequel trilogies. And as I was watching the original trilogy, like I noticed a lot of visual and thematic cues throughout the three movies that made me wonder: was George Lucas consciously or subconsciously being influenced by elements of Gothic fiction? So very briefly, I don't want to get too much into it because I do have a video that's going to drop the last Tuesday of this month, and I'll send Jonathan the link so he can share it with everybody. But but for the most part, Gothic fiction came about in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and when you think of Dracula, Frankenstein, those kinds of works, those would be considered Gothic works of Gothic fiction. But but Gothic fiction is also including elements such as the doomed maiden who is pursued and trapped by the villain. You have supernatural elements in there. You have the sort of undiscovered family history that gets revealed and leads to a dramatic shift in the narrative, right? As well as a bunch of sordid characters, from holy men to thugs and thieves to supernatural creatures like ghosts and demons. And when you apply it to what we see in Star Wars, it kind of it's almost like a Venn diagram. It kind of just overlays and overlaps, and you begin to see all these different elements of Gothic actually fitting pretty neatly into the Star Wars universe. And as soon as that clicked in my mind, I began to do a little bit more digging into not only what what is common or what are the common tropes of Gothic fiction, but how do they kind of fit into the whole Star Wars narrative? Because Star Wars is pretty unique among the science fiction genre, where a lot of the elements of Gothic kind of fit in pretty comfortably with our common understanding of science fiction, right? So as a kid, when you think of Star Wars, you think of X-Wings, TIE fighters, Millennium Falcon, that kind of stuff. What I also find kind of fascinating is the fact that you have elements like the Force, right, which is this sort of ethereal kind, I guess you could say, like a mystical, I guess, entity, for lack of a better word, that just that permeates throughout the Star Wars universe. But you also have Force ghosts, which is pretty unique in the science fiction genre, because usually when you look at science fiction, the closest that we get to a ghost are holograms, right, or digital copies of a person's consciousness that's implanted into a cybernetic being. I kind of, think of Alien Earth, for instance, where Wendy is a synthetic who gets the mind of a child transplanted into her body, or if you're a Star Trek fan, Captain Picard having his mind transferred into that of a synthetic body at the end of season 1 of Picard. But all the elements that we see in Star Wars, kind of fit in uniquely with the Gothic element. And that's what kind of drew my interest in not only doing this research but creating this video that that kind of outlines and explains what are the different Gothic elements that we see in each of the trilogies, right? So for me, what prompted this was I remember watching The Phantom Menace, many years ago. I won't say how long because I don't want to give away my age, but there was that scene where Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan are fighting Darth Maul, and Darth Maul is just one of those characters that when you look at him, let me pull it up real quickly right here. So with Darth Maul, he looks. I mean, if you were to show this to anybody who wasn't familiar with the Star Wars universe, or if you went back, 200, 300 years ago, and you showed it to someone, they would say that's a demon, that's a demonic creature. And when my mom saw me watching this fight, she was asking me, Luka, why are you watching the devil? And I paused for a little bit, and I said, well, that's not really the devil. That's an alien. But they kind of, they kind of got the wheels, the gears turning in my head, because now I began to wonder, well, if I were to show this to someone who was unfamiliar with the Star Wars universe, how would they perceive, these alien creatures? Because for us, at least in the West, or for those who are science fiction nerds, we can take the language of science fiction and apply them to entities that may look a little bit weird, right? So in terms of Darth Maul, for us, we would say, well, he's this alien creature from this planet, and he's a member of the species here. But what I do want to say is that, to go back to the to one of the tropes of Gothic fiction, we've got to keep in mind that people in the in the 18th and 19th centuries were very much informed by the religious thinking of their day. So they very much understood and believed in not only a reality that we can sense with our five senses, but a reality that existed beyond all human understanding, what theologians would call heaven or hell, right, or the spiritual realm. So as I'm watching the Star Wars movies, I'm just asking myself, is George Lucas subconsciously being influenced by his memories of the Gothic, right? And that may sound like a bit of a far-fetched statement to make, but think about it. I mean, we all grew up with Halloween. We're all familiar with the tropes of when it comes to Halloween, right? So witches and vampires and devils and demons and ghosts and werewolves and all that stuff. So for us, it's not too far-fetched to take that same imagery and maybe apply a different name to it. And it's kind of, and if you think about it, it's pretty common in science fiction. I mean, there is a Doctor Who episode called Vampires of Venice, where the vampires are reimagined as an alien species that came to Earth, and their appearance inspired the lore of the vampire, for instance. But what I'm positing here, and what I explained in the video is George Lucas, allowing these memories of the Gothic to imprint themselves into his movies. And I would say yes, because it's very, very difficult to escape these tropes, because whether you're making a horror film, or whether you're writing a story, or whether you're doing a podcast, or whether you're doing anything else, the Gothic does find its way into our aesthetics. So there is another clip I do want to show you here. And if anybody wants to interject, feel free to do so. But there is another scene that I actually want to show here where, and it's from A New Hope, and this is where Luke and Obi-Wan are on Tatooine. They enter that canteen, and we get to see some of the alien creatures. in that little canteen. So I just want you to pay attention to some of this going on here. So that's pretty normal, alien creatures and all that stuff. But so right off the bat, like you'll probably notice around here, and this is something that kind of caught my eye. I had to watch it a few times, but this particular creature right here, for me, looked a little bit familiar. And like I said, Halloween is like maybe a few weeks away. So anybody who's a fan of Universal monsters, that kind of looks a little bit like a werewolf to me. So I know some Star Wars fans out there will probably say, "Well, Luka, you're a bit of an idiot. That's not a werewolf at all." And granted, if you don't see a werewolf, like I do, that's fine. But for me, seeing a creature like that just made me think, like, what else is Lucas putting in there that we're missing or we're not seeing? So, so you have a bunch of these creatures here that look quite foreign to us, but again, with our language here, we would just say that they're aliens, right? And I got no way to fast forward through this, so we'll just have to go through all this a little bit. But there's another shot here that kind of stands out to me. So right there, that shot right there. I mean, obviously, that's a demonic looking figure. If you were to show this to someone who isn't familiar with the Star Wars universe or who's religiously minded, right? And again, I find it quite interesting that George Lucas is imprinting creatures, of that aesthetic, of that look into his movies, because if you're making a science fiction movie, your imagination can take you wherever you want to go. And as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking it's kind of interesting that George Lucas is taking creatures that would be traditionally understood as Gothic and kind of putting them in his films, because if you look at another franchise like Star Trek, for instance, a lot of the aliens that we see here are, for the most part, they're very alien, but they're not as influenced or as informed of the Gothic element like what we would see here in Star Wars. So I just found it kind of interesting that that Lucas is just putting these elements in here that just look a little bit too familiar, in my book.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So who wants to begin tackling this question among the two gentlemen on my right?
Oh, come on. Yeah, Chris Stonnell with Post-Mortem Players. For me, in my own work, obviously, it's kind of taking that horror and then influencing the art form of theater. Because generally, when we think of theater, we think of going to a show. We're not thinking of going to see horror. Although horror has been interwoven with theater since the very beginning. Go back to Greek tragedy with Oedipus. I mean, you can't think of anything more gruesome than that. Someone gouging out their own eyes. That's straight Fulci right there. So from the beginning, horror was exciting. In Greek, there are a lot of Greek comedies, there are things as well. But what do we only remember now? The Greek tragedies. Because that was what people liked to see. They wanted to see, even back then, they were drawn to those horrific stories. Another example I would say, looking back in history of theater, is I always love playing this game where I tell like plots of things and have to guess what it's from. Like there's a story where, to get revenge, a character bakes their enemies into pies. And if I say that to you, what immediately comes to mind? Well, she got the right answer, but yes, we think some of us probably think Sweeney Todd, but no, that's straight from Shakespeare. That's Titus Andronicus. So once again, there's nothing more gory than that example. And then for me personally, for Post-Mortem Players, kind of what got me interested into creating the company was I'd always heard this term grand guignol passed around and attributed to horror films. I never knew exactly what it meant. I thought maybe it was just a style of acting, but then I really found out that no, it was the name of an actual theater that operated in Paris from the late 1800s through 1962, and they specialized in doing works of horror. And a lot of those special effects, practical effects, blood effects that we still use today originated in that theater. In one of the plays, it's a play called The Ultimate Torture. So it's basically about a group who are huddled together while this outside enemy is trying to force its way into them. And then right at the end, you hear them at the door about to burst through. And so the father realizes then that all hope is lost. And so he murders his child to prevent them from the horrors outside the door, because that would be a worse death. Of course, then the doors broke down, and it ends up being the cavalry who's come to rescue them. Which I think Trenton Darabont had that idea in his mind when he wrote the new ending to The Mist in that film, because it's very much a parallel to that play from the John Hill. And so that's influenced me. Just kind of seeing that, the popularity of horror, and then being able to see it in front of you in theater. Those of you who got to see the show last night, The Final Kiss is a play from 1912 that premiered at the Grand Guignol. So that type of visceral horror, and even the stuff like we were pulling the skin off and things. That's the kind of stuff that they would do. And they really want to make it as realistic as possible. The Grand Guignol, so you wouldn't find ghosts and demons and those things in their stories. I call it, for the Grand Guignol, because I kind of call it the Law and Order method, where if you go to Law and Order, would always take like true stories from the headlines and then create an episode around it. That's sort of how they functioned there. They would kind of see what kind of gruesome murders and things happen in the real world and then put it on stage. So it's very realistic. They wanted their horrors to be things that could hypothetically happen in real life. And so since they were rooted in that realism, they wanted their gore effect to be as real as possible as well. So there were stories of them like going, I guess since we have the barbecue festival on the water here, there were stories of them going to hog farms and getting the leftover parts that they could then use on stage in their horror plays. There's a famous story of Ratino, who was their special effects guy, getting a whole bunch of cow eyeballs to use in some plays. Luckily, we didn't use any of that. There were no animals harmed in our show last night, but they went above and beyond for that gruesome stuff. And so that appealed to me, along with the popular horror. The Grand Guignol it closed down in the 60s because after coming out of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust and things that people saw, the appetite to go see these shows had waned. And the final director of the Grand Guignol said we couldn't compete with Buchenwald. Everything we did on stage we thought was kind of imaginary, and now we know even what we were doing doesn't compare to some things that actually happen in real life. So then also they were competing with the rise of horror films. By that time, they'd already fought with Universal, and then there was right at the rise of the Hammer films, which really now they were colorized. You could see the bright red blood and the gore effects, which was a lot cheaper than going to a play. So Grand Guignol went away. I felt like right now was the perfect time where that type of theater could work again. Just having people love horror, and especially if you're a film fan like me, you're getting there's this backlash now to some of that really bad CGI that we had, and I know there's this desire that we want to go back and see the old practical effects. We also spend our disbeliefs more if we see a practical effect than if we see some computer generated effect. And so I thought that's perfect, because that was one of the reasons Grand Guignol went away, was because people could tell what they were doing wasn't real. And I think now we're a little more forgiving and willing to kind of suspend to see those effects, because we appreciate the stage prep. I'm sure everyone last night knew that was just latex they were pulling off of the space, but the gasps and things we heard, and that you suspended your disbelief and believed that they were pulling chunks of flesh off him, or that her face was actually being burned rather than stuck into it's basically doing the old vinegar and baking soda trick to make the face burning. So that's sort of how it's influenced me with postmortem players.
My name's Todd. As far as how horror has affected my writing, I write. I'm currently, I kind of found my niche in writing comedic satire about the church, and the way that horror has influenced me is I'm a big fan of Rob Zombie's film The Devil's Rejects, and Bill Moseley tells a story of when he had to perform one of the sexual assault scenes that on Priscilla Barnes, that he went to Rob Zombie and said, "Man, I'm really feeling bummed about this. I feel really sad about this." And Rob just looked at him and told him, "Art is not safe." And I carry that into what I write and into what I do. I can show you, I can write something that you've seen a million times and play it safe, or I can challenge you and subvert your expectations as it should be. So art is not safe. I've taken that with me from the Rob Zombie at least. That's my answer.
Okay, well, thank you all for those detailed and informative answers. And another question that we had was, what are some examples of the opposite happening? Works from other genres influencing horror. And I don't know if we want to loop back around to Luka to begin with this. How about that? Can you hear us? What's happening?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was on mute. So you want me to go ahead and start with that?
Okay, yeah.
I would probably say, when it comes to other genres influencing horror, it's kind of secondary. And this is just coming from, from my view in reviewing and critiquing films, because really, when it comes to horror, that takes center stage. I mean, we can recognize horror whether it's in outer space or if it's in the 1930s South, like in Sinners, or if it's set in Hollywood, like in The Substance, really. So for me, I would say, we can put horror in whatever setting we want, and apply whatever genre we want, but it's going to be recognizably, horror first and foremost. Big one that comes to mind is Alien, because even though it's set, set in the depths of space, and you're on a spaceship, and you're in a confined space with this creature that is basically going around murdering everybody. I mean, there are elements about it that is just so recognizable. You really don't, it's really easy to kind of see it as horror and not anything else. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's the best way that I can understand it, from my end.
Would anybody else like to weigh in on that?
A couple of examples. You're just thinking of specific, like, non-horror things that influence horror. One thing that comes to mind, which probably is the last thing you would think of, but that's the Three Stooges. And if you think about how much the Three Stooges routines and that style, it's a major influence on Sam Raimi. And you see that especially in Evil Dead 2 and in Army of Darkness, and then in the film Intruder. If you haven't seen it, it's a great 80s slasher, very underseen. It takes place in a supermarket. It's directed by Scott Spiegel, who was one of Sam Raimi's friends and who worked on the Evil Dead films with him, and then made his own. And actually, Bruce Campbell makes a cameo at the end of the film. But even in that film, they brought in one of I can't think of the actor's name, who had a recurring role. He wasn't one of the main Stooges, but one of the guys that appeared in a lot of those films. He was still living, so they brought him in and even worked in his trademark line into that slasher, Intruder, just as that nod. But so that's one of those influences that have worked its way into horror. Another is the horror trope of the final girl, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. And we think of that specifically as this unassuming, very innocent, very pure young person who then is kind of put through the ringer and has to fight through all of these issues, and killers and slashers and whatnot, and then at the end comes out stronger. And we can think of a slew of horror movies. But one thing you probably don't think about is that trope actually shows up again in other films. Maybe not a physical or a literal killer or evil force, but even in movies like Erin Brockovich, which is more against corporate, starts off and then kind of finds her strength as she's fighting corporate America. Something like the Disney films like Mulan or Moana. Something like The Devil Wears Prada. If you kind of think of the the Miranda character as this kind of this evil entity that then has to be slain at the end. So there's that same trope of this empowerment of this generally female character who overcomes these obstacles and becomes a stronger person at the end. It's kind of the last one standing. Even some of the survival films like Wild with Reese Witherspoon, things like that, have those elements of that final girl trope transcending the horror genre. And to kind of tag on to what Luka was talking about earlier, doesn't always have to be a female. And if you look at A New Hope, I mean, Luke Skywalker really is almost, in that film, is almost like that final girl character. Starts off as someone who just wants to work on their, the farm on Tatooine, very innocent, very, very raw, and you're very naive. And then throughout the course of the film, fighting all of these challenges, fighting all of these obstacles, then becomes this stronger leader towards the end, especially as we continue in the further films, how much he progresses from where he started. So you can almost see a little bit of that as well.
Okay. Got anything? Okay. Well, here's something that strays a little bit from our thesis, but we often say that we like to get a little art into horror at Haunted Tamrico. That's what we do. And we've asked this question during a panel before, but I think it's worth repeating and getting your perspectives on. And the question is, are art and horror mutually exclusive? Is horror just entertainment? And if so, is that a bad thing? Who wants to begin with that one?
I mean, I would say to that question, ask A24 that question, ask Robert Eggers that question, somebody asked her that question. I think they really have in this recent trend of infused more kind of like this art house horror. And I think they would consider what they're doing as horror. And I mean, and even looking at horror in its most base form, there's some of our 80s slashers and things. I mean, there's still art in there. I mean, the crap that it takes. We don't tell one of the makeup artists that they're not a real artist, because that takes a lot of skill and a lot of creativity. And I think maybe we don't view it that way because it's not high art. It's not, we're not going into a gallery and seeing paintings. Although I would say that Munch's The Scream is pretty horrific, and especially there's a lot of horror elements in famous artwork. But I would definitely say that you told me in and they think they're an artist. Just because our actors last night were filming a horror play, that doesn't make them any less of a performer. I think they definitely review themselves as artists, and so I think they're 100% connected in there. And I said I've loved this rise in kind of art house horror films that we've had over the past decade or so, with films like The Lighthouse and Midsummer and The Witch, which for me, I'm also a history buff, and so I love how Eggers just infuses. To try to be as historically accurate as possible, like the way he went to make sure that all of the characters in The Witch spoke authentically as what the language would have been like in late 1600s America. And it was even like the most controversial part of Nosferatu was his enormous horn sash, which I don't know anyone who liked it, but Robert Eggers defended it, and he made a good point that any Transylvanian nobility who would have buried and died at that time would have had a mustache. If you look at the pictures, the paintings of Vlad Tepes, who obviously the inspiration for Dracula, he's got an enormous mustache. It was just him. He's like, I can't. That's historically accurate. That's all we have to do, no matter how ridiculous it might be.
Okay, good answer. Luka, you want to say something about this?
I would say they're not exclusive. Right? They kind of play off each other in a way. And to Chris's point about Robert Eggers, what I find so interesting about Robert Eggers is that he's leading into stories that are actually pretty familiar to us. And I would and since Chris highlighted The Witch, I was going to highlight The Northman, because The Northman, when if you read it in context of the Viking Age, he's very he's leading into the horrors of what was going on at that time, because if you think about, the Vikings were pretty brutal, and what they did was very visceral and very nasty. So he's not holding back on any of that. But furthermore, as someone who reads and does shows about Shakespeare on this podcast, what what Robert Eggers does in The Northman is he's basically telling the story of Hamlet. This is Hamlet before Shakespeare, tidies him up with ruffs and skulls and the gloomy halls of Elsinore. This is this is Hamlet at its basic. This is the Hamlet that Saxo Grammaticus wrote about in his legend that centuries later writers like William Shakespeare would pick up on and turn it into the story that we're all familiar with today. And I would even go so far as to go back to my premise from the very beginning, where the Gothic elements and the horror elements that were familiar to us in not only literature but also art, from from the Romantic period onward, influences the way that filmmakers kind of apply their visuals in order to enhance the atmosphere within their films. I mean, again, looking at Robert Eggers, even if looking at the Hammer horror films, just just the way that the colors are utilized, especially red, kind of just pronounces just how important the visual element is, the artistic element is, in order to enhance not only the story but the tension in the atmosphere. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay. Todd, you want to tackle this? Ask me the question one more time. It was about art and horror, basically. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. They don't have to be. I think that this elevated horror. Look at what Jordan Peele has done. He's a great example of being able to take very difficult emotional situations and make you feel like, well, what if this happened to me? And I envy him for that. I also think a film like Nicholas Winding Refn's A Neon Demon is a great example of horror bleeding into other genres. Because if you really look at that film, and you really, probably if I read the script, I would think this is a pure horror movie. But it's shot, it's a thriller, but it's shot like a horror film. It's on Prime, Neon Demon, if you get a chance to look at it. Brilliant film. Don't have your kids around. Or do, depends on how you raise them. Not my business. All right. I was allowed to watch stuff that I shouldn't have watched as a kid, and don't let your kids watch that stuff. Okay.
Just real quick on that, you brought up Neon Demon, talking about horror influencing. Would we have Neon Demon if we didn't have Suspiria? There's a lot of those color elements, a lot of stuff that I think that shows up and as that. And then one of the thought I had, just thinking of other genres influencing horror. I mean, we go back to say like the Christopher Guest movies, like Spinal Tap. That's sort of almost like the original found footage film in a way. So we have Blair Witch if we did not have Spinal Tap and Waiting for Guffman. And then that influencing the horror genre, it's a great film. It's underseen. If you haven't seen it, it's called Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon, which is a mockumentary about a film crew following around a slasher from a slasher film, and it's great. It's got Scott Wilson from The Walking Dead in Cold Blood in the film. He's like an old retired slasher who's telling his ways. But it's so funny, especially if you're a fan of the slasher genre, all of the different tropes and things that he picks up on in selecting his final girl. And there's like the character who, I forgot what the nickname is, but it's like the Dr. Loomis character. They always have one of those guys who's chasing after him. And so, once again, that's a direct, from those Christopher Guest movies. And then, from there, I mentioned to Blair Witch. And then, if we have Spinal Tap to Blair Witch, then, do we have The Office? I mean, it's all very similar to some of the sound footage, from there to the documentary found footage from starting there to horror to our consciousness.
Okay, these have been some good insights. We're going to do one more planned question, and then I think we'll open the floor for audience questions because we have plenty of time. And if there aren't a lot of audience questions, we'll circle back around to another planned question. Maybe this one is kind of expected, and we have touched on it before, but I think we'd be interested in hearing your answers. What are some of your favorite new trends in
horror specific to films. And anybody can start.
I volunteered to go last.
Want to go first, Luka?
No, I'll go last just because I got to think
Okay.
about this.
So Chris looks like he's ready.
I guess, yeah. I mean, we touched on some of these things already. I mean, the work that directors like Robert Eggers are doing. Been really. I mean, also I'm a huge fan of Mike Flanagan. I love everything that Mike Flanagan has touched. Just the way he's reinvented some of these kind of Victorian stories, like classic ghost stories like The Haunting of Hill House, or The Turn of the Screw, which then became the Haunting of Bly Manor. I love what he's doing, and the way, and to me, the most glorious thing he's ever done, and was, if anyone has seen Dr. Sleep, the film that Flanagan directed, but the way he was able to create a sequel to The Shining that was faithful not only to the book and made Stephen King happy, which doesn't happen often, it also made a perfect sequel to the Kubrick film that we all know. And to me, that was just this Herculean task to make a film that was good, that satisfied both of those things. Because that was always Stephen King's biggest complaint with the Kubrick film, was that it missed the essence of the original book, which was Jack Torrance's struggle with alcoholism, and everything was sort of a metaphor for that, where he felt like Nicholson was kind of insane from the beginning, where you did see this more methodical descent into madness. So it was nice seeing the way he was able to fuse those two things together. I really enjoyed the films by Oscar Perkins, who, soon you all know, but if not, he's the son of Anthony Perkins of Psycho, Norman Bates fame. He's made some really interesting films lately, and I can't think of the director's name, but the one who did Barbarian and Weapons. I don't know, I haven't even figured out how to classify them yet, but they're horror. I mean, there's fear, but then they have this over the top, almost slapsticky element to them as well, with the way the creatures attack, and it's this interesting blending where you can be scary, but then also have these really campy, over the top elements at the same time. So I'm really intrigued to kind of see
it. I think there's a great place for just your plain old slasher B horror film that had hardly any money, and the makeup is not what you would maybe expect from a studio picture. But what I'm seeing is that I'm really appreciating as far as trends in horror is, as we mentioned before, the elevated horror that they're going for. And, we're not for Kubrick's version of The Shining. I don't think we'd have any of this. That's thanks to Stephen King, I suppose, and Kubrick himself. But I just always think about poor Shelley Long and what she had to go through. That's not right. But anyway, I think studios are understanding that we like horror, and that there's a market for it, and that we will go support a horror film if it's something that actually looks decent enough. I'm just hoping that the people who cut trailers will work a little harder not to give too much away, because I don't watch trailers anymore, so I don't know what's in the theater, because you're going to ruin the film for me if I watch 2 minutes of whatever you're trying to tell me. So I don't do that anymore. But the elevated horror, really, there's a lot of great work out there right now that's that's getting proper attention critically as well. Okay, Luka, would you like to contribute here?
Yeah, I would say for me, like the biggest trend that I see is actually the more of a focus on true crime. The one that comes to mind is it was that series that came out on Netflix not too long ago, Monster, about Ed Gein. And then a few years earlier there was that I think it was either a movie or series with Zac Efron as Ted Bundy. So I think while not exactly strictly horror, I think it kind of falls in line, because a lot of these mass murders and serial killers were the inspiration for slasher icons. Like Ed Gein obviously was one of the inspirations for Leatherface. when Toby Hooper did Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So for me, like to see like the I wouldn't say the rise, but like an increase in documentaries and movies focusing on serial killers, kind of, I would say, kind of takes us back to the roots of slasher horror, to where we're getting to see the men who kind of laid the foundation, as it were, for the slasher movies that would come out later in the 70s and 80s. So that's the trend that I'm noticing. That's the trend that I'm kind of has garnered my interest over the past few years.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. I think now we'll open the floor for questions, and they can be relevant to what we've been discussing or something more far afield. So don't all talk at once. Anyone who wants to go may ask a question of these fellows on the panel, our unholy trio here.
This question for the board. So what are like common tropes in horror movies that you just totally think that are not your favorite per se? What are like some horror movies that really think horror movie tropes, excuse me, that really think turn off people from horror movies?
I think when you have genre, you can't avoid tropes completely, or else it's not of that genre to an extent. But I say learn all the tropes so that you can completely subvert expectations. I think it's in how you perform the trope, how you write it. Because I can see someone get hit in the axe with a face in I don't know how many movies, and it doesn't, and at this point it doesn't faze me. Okay. But if you put someone at the top of the stairs and it's someone that the filmmaker has made me hate, and they roll down the stairs with the axe still in their face, I'll find that hilarious. That's what you're dealing with here, people. Okay. But I think in how you perform it is obviously we need to watch for racial and minority tropes, like, obviously I don't want to write anything that's going to turn you want to make movies for everybody. You want as many people to see as possible. So you want to avoid those, where you just throw somebody in, obviously, because it was, you didn't have a good purpose for that character. So, yeah, I would say that's one thing.
Yeah, I think some of it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Because obviously, you're someone who's watched hundreds and hundreds of horror films. You wait for things. You're like, you hear a noise, okay, that's in this direction. We know that the whole thing where they open the mirror and close the mirror, and you're already waiting for someone to be there. So I think some of it comes with you. Someone who hasn't seen a lot, that's when you do to them. Or it's like a lot of times I'll watch older horror movies with people and they're like, God, that's so predictable. And it's like, yeah, but it wasn't predictable when this was made. These tropes came from somewhere, and it was successful here, and then they were repeated year in and year out. As he was mentioning, with minority tropes, even today, trying to watch older horror movies with a younger crowd, trying to watch the 80s slashers, and they can't get over the the way that the female characters are used in a lot of those films as eye candy and in some very misogynistic ways. So it's it's even looking at films in the context of when they were made, and things that are more acceptable at the time versus how they seem to a modern one. So I think some of it comes to, as I mentioned, the individual person and their views on what they're seeing.
No,
Luka.
I think he's just.
Yeah, what was the question?
The question I asked was, what is like a common trope or tropes that you think is like a big turnoff for audience from horror movies in general? What's like a common trope you just like totally disregard?
Well, I mean, there are a lot. I know jump scares kind of get overdone quite a lot, but at the same time, it's it is kind of fun because even though it's coming, especially if it's a trope that you've seen play out in movies time and time again, it's still fun to have because it's it's one of those things where even though you know it's coming, you still want it to happen because it's sort of like hearing the same joke over and over again. But if you really like it, or if it kind of works or fits in the story, you still want it to happen because you still want to be surprised either way, even though you know what's going to happen in the next shot. I would also say too, a lot of the things that the other two panelists have said are very much true. So I'm not sure if I can add any more to it. But what I will also add too is that sometimes these tropes do get parodied quite a lot, and it's fun just to see how these people kind of take something that is expecting conventional, kind of subvert it or kind of poke fun at it. And it's just a joke that everybody can kind of get behind, because we all know, yeah, this is something that's on brand with the horror genre, or any genre for that matter. But you still enjoy it because it's a familiar element, right? If you take the jump scare out of horror, then you're probably just sitting and asking yourself, well, what's going on here? Like, is this something that's not following the playbook, or are they going to be doing something different? And if they do something different, is it something that I'm going to be very accepting of, or is that going to turn me off? So.
Okay. I had one. Don't kill the dog. Who orcs have questions?
This question is for the filmmakers. Once you have a script, once you've selected it, what is your next step getting it on the film? Or what advice would you give to get it on
I knew I got here. No, the truth is, you have to sell not only yourself, but the project. And if your passion is not contagious, then you're not going to get anyone to work with you. If you want to shoot a short film, you can get people to volunteer for a Friday night and a Saturday and that sort of thing, and get away with maybe getting them to volunteer, I'm trying to make a feature-length film. I've got several scripts that are ready to go, or just about ready to go. And I'm desperately reaching out to people who I'm hoping will be interested without being a salesman, because I grew up with that, and I preferred sales, and I was terrible at it because I didn't believe in the product. But if you believe in your product, like I was telling this fellow up here earlier, he's got a script there that he knows needs to be told. It's a story that needs to be told. Well, if you don't feel like it needs to be told, if you don't have that driving you, you'll never have the resilience necessary to put a team together and to actually shoot and then edit. It's a lot. So I would say start with being very resilient about your story, because I've been working on a script for some time now, for years, and it's still, I'm calling in favors as best I can, keep good karma too, because it comes back, Well, Gary Woolard here, and I know an independent filmmaker down in the New Orleans area. His name is Joe Badon. And I watched that man raise about $20,000 online from his followers, because he cultivates followers on social media through his visual art. He's a visual artist. And I'm not really sure how he worked that magic, but he's made some pretty unusual independent films, one of which we screened one year. I think it was our first year, 2019. And so if you're going the independent route, I always say, think like Joe. However he thinks. And Todd is right. A short is much easier to get made, obviously, than a feature length, which requires so much more financing, so much more time.
It's a great idea. That's a great place to start. I'm actually considering that. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, that is a good way to start. I don't know if Chris or Luka would like to answer this question. I know you're not filmmakers per se, but you're definitely adjacent.
I mean, the comic genre wears money. Obviously, that's the easiest solution. I mean, yeah, I would say, yeah, especially if you're trying to build that name. Obviously, the more name recognition, the more familiar with what you do. I mean, the hardest part is that getting started and gaining that. I mean, I would say, for me as a theater person, don't discount your local community theaters. And if you got a script, I mean, go get. I'm sure there are always actors who love to do table reads. You get it in front of them, get them to, then you've got people who bought in, they enjoy it, and go from there. I would say we definitely. I don't know if it's the end all be all, but I know there's times where I've been hit with some like crowd funding sources for someone to write a new horror book or horror boot, I'm like, oh, I like that. I like that idea. So, I'll donate a little bit to it. So, I mean, I think there are people out there willing to contribute. So I think it was, as I was mentioning, just, really knowing how to sell it and present it. Because if I see a really cool idea, I really would love to see this come to fruition. Putting a few bucks behind it's not, something I'd be willing to do. So, I mean, I kind of I started my own theater company, so yeah, well, when I started Postmortem Players, it was me. There was no like group of investors or a whole bunch of friends. I literally woke up one day in July of 2022 and filled out the paperwork with the Secretary of State, North Carolina. It's a woman's company. And then I went from there, and I went to the theater I grew up in and said, hey, I got this idea. I'm doing something totally different. Would you be willing to partner with me? I would be happy to share a ticket to sell box office profit with you if I can kind of use the space. Now, I had an in there because I had been doing stuff at theater for 30 years, so they knew me. So it wasn't like I was walking in cold, but it's to me, it's in Charlotte, it's one of these, I like to say it's one of these model relationships where arts groups can support one another, which, I always like to say when arts groups work together, everyone wins. And so I wouldn't have survived. We wouldn't have been here last night had it not been for that theater taking a chance and saying yes. We have our black box space that we don't use very often. Although once we prove that it could be used, now they're using it. So I can't get any date for them. But that's worked out because the money I'm raising is going back to support this theater that gave me my start, that I grew up in. So some of my money is going to help them, but also supporting us. And there's a lot of actors who come in who love horror. They come and do my shows. They say, this theater's kind of cool, and they stick around and audition and do things for the other theater, and vice versa. So it's been this great way, this symbiotic relationship that's really worked out well, helped us survive. I don't know if it's a film equivalent, but but I'm sure as I mentioned, looking around for acting groups or community theaters, at least to get something read. I'm sure, and usually they're more than willing to do that for free, or do a what I would call like a reader's workshop, maybe where they're all standing on stage with the music stands and read the script to an audience. You have someone's reading the setups and the stage directions and things, and then do an invited audience and get feedback. And those are all good opportunities. Just kind of using the way that plays are developed, and then maybe applying it to us.
Okay, Luka, did you want to address this one?
I mean, I've interviewed a lot of filmmakers on the podcast, and the common thing that they always tell me is that it's always about making those connections, because you can write the best script around here, but if you don't have that relationship or that network of people to to work with, it's going to be kind of difficult to kind of get the project up and running. And even when you are making this film, and once you're done, obviously you still want to maintain those relationships, because hey, sometimes you'll be using the same people over and over again for different projects throughout the years. I know money is a huge issue. I know that takes a lot of convincing. Todd mentioned it earlier. I mean, you really have to sell the product, that in order to get people to part with either tens of dollars or hundreds or thousands of dollars in order to finance that project. So for as someone who went to film school, it's not something that they really teach you, but you really need to learn how to develop, the sort of confidence to be able to sell, anything to, prospective investors and just say, hey, I believe in this project. I know this is going somewhere. I would really, really appreciate it if you can, help support what I'm trying to do here, and not only with investors, but also with, people in the local acting community, because actors can say no to some of these projects. So it's not only important to build that personal relationship, but it's also to kind of ensure that this is something that that will be worth their time and effort in investing their talent into making into making this project and bringing it to fruition, that they later put on screen, whether it's at film festivals or personal showings or whatever.
I'll say, as Luka's talking about making those connections, you don't be afraid to shoot for the stars. The worst someone can say is no. A lot of the people who work for me now are ones who have reached out to me and said, "Hey, I really love Heart, or anything I can do," and you're bringing them into the fold. Like the director of The Final Kiss, who now has kind of become our special effects wizard. She wrote me one time and said, "Hey, I really am interested in this horror theater thing. Could we get coffee one day?" And yes, and now she's amazing, and I couldn't. The theater wouldn't exist without her. And it was because she sent an email. For me, back, this is probably 20 years ago. One of my favorite films of all time is the 1984 Fright Night. And because I thought the characters are so well developed in that story that it would make a great stage film. And I was naive, so I looked up Tom Holland, not Spider-Man Tom Holland, but screenwriter Tom Holland, who wrote Fright Night and wrote Child's Play. I found his MySpace account, and I sent it. I wrote him to MySpace, said, "Hey, I'm this guy in Charlotte. I really would love to adapt Fright Night into a film. Into a stage version, into a musical." And he wrote me back and said, "Absolutely." And he's so excited. And here's my agent. Here's this. And had I not written. Now it didn't come to fruition because then I found out quickly how Hollywood works. And even though he was interested, that meant nothing. I had nowhere near the amount of money. So I reached out to the agent, said, "I can't talk to you. I can only talk to you through your lawyer." So I found an entertainment lawyer. They said it's $300 an hour. I said, "I can pay for 1 hour." So it ended up ultimately not going anywhere. And I also, if you hated the Fright Night remake that came out, you can. I feel like I may be partially to blame because there's a rule that if the author someone wants the rights and you've agreed you can sell them, the studio has right of first refusal to do something with that property. So shortly after all this conversation, they announced the remake, and I was like, "No, it's high," because I was poking around with Paramount. Oh man, I guess we need to do something with these before someone gets them. So you can blame me.
So you're the one.
Yeah, it's my fault.
Well, we are out of time, I'm afraid, but I want to thank Chris, Todd, and Luka for giving us their time and their wisdom today, and thank all of you for joining us. We are going to start up karaoke again in a moment, and then the award ceremony begins at 4 p.m. So thank you, gentlemen. Oh, we're finishing right on time. So proud of us. And have a good rest of the day.